Hi, my name is Leah Day, and welcome to Quilt Along number 12 on the Free Motion Quilting Project. This week we're going to take stippling, the design that we've been working on since the beginning of the year, and we're going to shrink it down into its smallest, tiniest form. And that actually has a different name, microstippling. And how I'm going to do this, I'm just demonstrating on a 10-inch block, and I've marked an 8-inch square inside of it, and I stitched within that. And this is a really good idea. You don't need a lot of fabric, a big quilt, in order to practice this because it's so small. And what's a really good idea is to start with, of course, the simplest shapes and work from big into smaller scales, simply because that kind of gets you moving and slowly shrinking and changing that mental idea of how big the design is with each row. So let's see how this works on the sewing machine. So let's get started, and the first thing is working on a 1/4 of an inch scale. We're going to go from kind of a big size stippling to a small size stippling. And this is a very good scale to start with. And you can see I even started a bit bigger with the 1/2 inch scale, just working some wiggly U shapes, just playing with scale, getting this kind of idea of different sizes and shapes in mind. And of course it does help to have an object of some kind that is the size or the width of what you're stitching. And so this is on an 1/8 of an inch scale, and you can look around your sewing room, and I found a seam ripper to be a very useful tool, not just for ripping seams, but also it has many different sizes on the seam ripper that allow me to look and kind of get a good idea of what size I was stitching. And then the tiniest, smallest scale, I'm going to use the blade of the seam ripper as a guide. And this is right around a 1/16 of an inch. It's very dense. You might not want to go this dense. You might want to just practice with an 1/8 of an inch stippling. It's really entirely up to you how small you want to go. But this smaller 1/16 of an inch is really what I would consider micro stippling. I'm going to zoom in here so you can see it just a little bit better. And you can see that when you get this small, your foot can get in the way, and it can be a little challenging to see where you're stitching because your foot is actually right on top of those stitches and can be a little tricky. The best advice is just simply to kind of keep in mind what you're doing, and with these U shapes it's the easiest because all we're doing is wiggling back and forth. And whenever you're stitching a more complex version of stippling, of course, just remember where you've stitched and where you're stitching next. And the easiest way to do this is simply stitching it in a row. So now we're going to kind of work on that more complex version of stippling. I'm taking a look at my touchstone. I'm going to stitch this on a 1/4 of an inch scale. And I'm just working on a complex, wiggly design that doesn't cross itself. And you can work on those U shapes, go into all the different shapes that we worked on in Quilt Along number 1, and work row after row on a 1/4 inch, 1/8 inch, and then a 16-inch scale. And just play with each one of those rows until you're able to get this kind of complex version of the design. Now let's see what it looks like when it's stitched on an 1/8 of an inch scale. And hopefully you'll notice immediately this video is regular speed right here. So this is the actual speed that it's being stitched. And hopefully you'll notice that you're filling half the amount of space at double the amount of time. So it's going to be much more time consuming to fill on a smaller scale, simply because you're not filling and covering that much space as you go. And that can be kind of the frustrating part about stitching densely, is that it becomes, instead of an hour to quilt a quilt, it becomes 16 hours to quilt your quilt. And that time-consuming nature is kind of a cost side of stitching densely. However, stitching densely is also very beautiful, and it is a skill that many quilters want to gain. So here we're going to finish off this 1/8 of an inch scale stippling. And you can see that this is actually fairly wide. I'm kind of working up and down at the same time to stitch this row. Truthfully, a solid row of a complex version of this should probably only be about an inch wide. And now it's time to shrink it down even further to the tiniest microstippling version. And here I'm only stitching a row that's about a half of an inch wide. That's about as much space as I can handle without having to wiggle upwards and downwards too much. So I'm just kind of wiggling down, and then I'll wiggle up for a little bit and then wiggle back down for a little bit. And you really kind of just have to get your own design within this, kind of get your own game plan with how you're stitching it. But I do work in rows, even within a real quilt. The rows are always there, and being able to stitch, even a row of stippling that's maybe a quarter of an inch wide will be very helpful. Of course, we didn't come here just to learn microstippling in a 10-inch square. We also need to learn how to fill our heart and feather whole cloth quilt. So let's see how that works on the machine right now. Now for this section of the videos, I have had to speed everything up to double speed. And we're going to fill first one of the hearts in the center of the quilt. And you'll notice immediately that I'm stitching this very dense stippling in a row. I'm stitching up from the point of the heart around kind of the curve of the heart, and I don't stitch too much of the outline before I go in and fill the middle. If you stitch just off the outline, you'll end up with puckers and a pleat in the middle of the heart as you reach that area. So you want to kind of work off the edge for a bit, but not too far, and then kind of work a row into the middle. I hope this makes sense. Work a row into the middle, fill that spot, and then work a row kind of right through that area, filling it in, and then back down right along that edge. So you can see that it's really just a matter of taking whatever width row that you're comfortable with and stitching that along the edges but also through the middle. Now, truthfully, the area between the heart motifs and the inner squares is actually going to be a lot easier to fill simply because there's a lot less space. So actually the space left, the background area, is perfectly able to be filled with a single row running right through the area. So I'm just simply filling kind of an upward downward motion. I kind of stitch up against the heart and then I stitch back down against the square shapes. And I'm just working basically kind of from edge to edge, just kind of wiggling in there, filling that space. You'll notice that I used white thread for the outline of my motifs, and then I'm using a very dark navy blue thread for the stippling. And of course this means that it's very noticeable for me to travel stitch, so I'm not doing that very much. But if you matched the same two colors of thread, you could of course travel stitch a considerable amount along the edges of those motifs. Now I want you to pay attention to where my right hand is, and especially my index finger. See how much my index finger is rubbing up against the side of my foot? My index finger is actually kind of controlling the design. I'm actually shaping and moving that design with my index finger. I'm pushing the foot around. The other fingers are holding and pushing the quilt. But really a lot of the control that I have over the stitch is caused because I'm actually touching the back of that foot and controlling it and pushing it around with my index finger. And that is a super important tip. And I'm glad I was able to show it to you in this video because I could not stitch this consistently or this densely without having that available to me. And some feet will allow it and some feet won't. It really just depends on your machine. It depends on how it's set up. If you can have your hand there at that close to your foot, but it's definitely something to pay attention to. Now I've zoomed in quite a bit because I want you to see how this filling works on a tiny scale. Like I said, anytime I have a wider area, I'm going to kind of stitch upwards into that area, into that little point of that heart, or where the hearts come together, fill in that whole area, but rather than continuing to work along the edges of the heart, I'm going to come on down and fill that lower area where those boxes, those straight lines are, because I don't want to get too far ahead of myself or I'll end up with potentially having excess fabric that could cause a pleat or just simply a lump in the quilt. And of course, this is a little nitpicky. Really fill it however feels most comfortable for you. But this is something that I really pay attention to when I'm filling any of my show quilts, is I make sure not to fill too much of the edges before going in and filling the center, simply because you have some shifting. You're going to have shifting, particularly on a tiny scale like this, because you're shifting so much and squishing so much of the fabric and the batting together as you stitch this densely. So just keep that in mind. Work up, then work down for a bit, and if anything, just simply expand your row as you come into wider areas, but always be able to shrink it back down again. Here's a good example of this. I'm going to work just a solid row within this little triangle, and this is how I filled all of the triangles in this quilt. I'm going to work a nice little 1/2 inch row all the way over, and I'm going to wiggle in there and grab that corner. You see that little point, and wiggle my way back out again. Now I'm just going to work another row, wiggling right over, and finish up in that bottom point. That's a great way to fill that triangle. Now the space between the outer squares, the interlocking squares, and the feathers, that's pretty much kind of the same as filling the inner section. It's a narrow section, so it's fairly easy to fill. You are going to have some areas that are a little bit wider, and you just need to wiggle down and fill those, but then wiggle back up and fill it consistently. Again, notice my index finger. See how close it is. See how much that finger is controlling and pushing, and really it's the thing that's doing most of the work. I'm controlling the foot, and that is controlling the stitch length and the stitch width, and of course then the movement of the quilt too. It's definitely a skill. It might be something that you want to just work on and play with, feel what is most comfortable for you, but of course always be careful of your fingers being this close to the needle, and watch out for that needle. It is actually quite easy to stitch through your fingers, so be careful whenever you are this close. So that's it for this week. I really hope that you'll get into your sewing room and give microstippling a try. You can really get a lot of practice in a very small amount of space, but I still advise you to work the same way that we stitch large-scale stippling, and that is in rows, and go from kind of a very simple version of the design to a more complex version of the design. And this way you'll work in kind of a logical progression, you won't get lost, and you'll be able to slowly get control of how big the design is and be able to shrink it down consistently. It is something that requires practice. You might not be able to get your microstippling down as tiny as mine, and I've had a lot of practice with it. Keep that in mind. But you can at least give it a good try, and I promise that the more you play with this, the smaller and tighter and denser your stippling will get. I would advise you, because your skill can kind of change radically with this, to try and fill an entire area of your quilt with every time that you work on it. So for example, when you sit down, try and do all 4 of the hearts in the center of the heart and feather whole cloth. Try and do, maybe another day, try and do the inner square area, simply because as you get more confident with your microstippling, it will get tighter and denser, and it's kind of a noticeable change from the beginning. So try and fill an entire space before moving on to the next one and before stopping for the night. So I hope that makes sense, and you'll get on your sewing machine and give microstippling a try. Of course, link up your blog and share your progress with last week's Stitching on a Line. I know it is challenging, but I really hope that you've got some good questions to ask and get some help with our free motion quilt along. So until next time, let's go quilt. Please share this video with your friends and find many more free motion quilting videos at freemotionproject.com.